All right, now welcome to the Dave Knows Wrestling Podcast. I'm your host, David Lee, and this is
Albanese.
That's right, and so finally we're back, and this time, if you're watching, I actually have the camera set up so you can see my face, so that's going to be a nice change of pace. All right.
At least they can see my face. That's beautiful.
That's true. So, Albert, you might have recognized him from our first episode, as well as Albert has also been on my show as a guest before, and I've also been on his as the Slam Sessions. So, welcome back to the show, Albert.
Well, thank you, Dave. It makes me feel nice that you wanted me back.
Oh, of course. Okay. So, now on your show, the Slam Sessions, which is already out, so you should be listening to this after that one, so check out the Slam Sessions if you haven't already. But in your show, you were talking about the Attitude Era and booking and how you really feel that booking was really superior in that time period. Now, what's the main reason that you think that is so?
Well, I know a lot of people don't like Vince Russo, and they don't subscribe to the Vince Russo way of professional wrestling. But you can't, deny the fact that Vince Russo had a knack for booking his wrestling shows like a television show. They were episodic. Every week there was a main strain running through. Stone Cold needs to get to Vince McMahon this week, so throughout the entire show, Stone Cold tried to get to Vince McMahon. There was always something new, always something exciting, and every segment ended with you looking at the TV and going, well, I can't change the channel because I want to see what happens next.
Okay, now that's fair. Now, I am one of those people who are not a Vince Russo guy. However, I will give you that he is good for TV. That is good at what he does. And I think a lot of people who are against Vince Russo wouldn't take that away from him either. But where I stand for that is, I think we're on equal footing when it comes to being a Paul Heyman guy. But where I differ from you is, no, because I know this about you, but I actually am a Jim Cornette kind of guy.
Yeah, you see, here's the thing. Jim Cornette is great when it comes to the old school way of booking. Heels versus baby faces. Heels got to get heat. Babyface gets the big win in the end. The normal storytelling. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I just think sometimes you need to jazz things up a little bit, which is why I loved Heyman.
Well, here's the thing. Now, Heyman aside, because I know we agree on Heyman, but when it comes to Vince Russo, I'll give you that he knows how to compose a television program. But in terms of a lot of his stunt work that he does and a lot of the things he did, you gotta say, as Jim Cornette has pointed out, hot shotting will only get you so far. Doing something specifically for shock value leaves you in one or two positions. Either one, you keep trying to outdo yourself to keep the audience watching, or two, the crowd just gets bored with it, and eventually you might even find that you wind up losing more money at the end of it than if you had just stayed the course and never done any of that hot shotting in the first place. So what do you think about that?
I mean, I'm half and half on that. I mean, I don't know. Vince Russo gets a lot of flack for hot-shotting.
Yes.
And, to a point, I believe that there are some segments where you can sit there and think, man, every week it looked like Russo was really, that's what his goal was. But if you look at the composition of his work, with the exception of the over-sexualized characters that he used, most of his work was basically trying to get a babyface to get to get over. Stone Cold Steve Austin, they recognized what they had with him. They booked him strong every week, and it wasn't that they had a hot shot with him every week. He walked out, that glass broke, people reacted. He put stars in the right places to get them where they needed to go so that fans would identify with them. And do I think Russo's been perfect? No. I mean, look, let's face it. He's the same guy we're talking about who booked a Viagra on a pole match. The same guy who booked a Judy Bagwell on a forklift match.
And the final match of Mr. Perfect, he booked as well. And do you know what that was?
What was that?
It was an axe handle on a pole match against David Flair.
Well, see, here, this is what I'm saying. Look, he's not perfect. I think that Russo worked really well in the WWE because he had Vince McMahon to come back and, combat some of the ideas that he had, which he vehemently denies happens. But, I mean, we all know that that's the truth.
Well, see, now I said that about him, too, that I always thought he'd be good as long as someone was there to keep him in check. But as we saw at the end of WCW when Eric Bischoff was there to keep him in check, it really didn't. Now, believe me, I have my own problems with Bischoff, but I'm just saying, we've had now other game positions where Vince Russo was there and he had someone else to oversee him, and yet we still don't get the same results. And the same thing could be said about a lot of bookers, is that it's got to be a booking team and not just a single solitary booking person. But still, I think that's what exposed Vince Russo's weaknesses, is when Vince Russo was there. Now, what I liked about what you said, though, is when you pointed out with Stone Cold Steve Austin, he was a star and they booked the star correctly. And I could not agree that a lot of the problems I have with certain WWE talent today and booking today is that they don't take their stars, who are definitely stars, and book them correctly.
But, I can't disagree with that.
Right. But Jim Cornette, on the other hand, will totally acknowledge that there are guys with that special factor who can draw a house, who can pack in seats, and those are guys you have to favor. So it's not that Jim Cornette or Vince Russo disagree with that. Both of them understand that. However, on the same token, I will say I think it's a little weird or it's a little suspicious. Why do you think it is that during Austin's initial run with the belt, the main event scene was just Austin, Undertaker, and Kane until The Rock and Foley eventually joined in there? Like, if he is so good at placing people with that star power, why was the main event so dry? And I like all those guys. I'm just saying, when Austin first won the belt at WrestleMania 14, until Survivor Series, it was the same. He had Foley. Foley was just an easy lob-up challenge. Foley wasn't a real threat at that time. And we all know it. He was still doing the Dude Love thing and all that. Rock was nowhere near a main event picture.
Still Intercontinental Champion.
Right. So, how was that? If Russo was so good at making sure stars stay at star power, where was that?
Lack of star power. They really didn't have many other guys to go with. They had The Rock at that point. You can say to a point, The Rock wasn't ready for his main event push when he got it.
You can say that, yeah.
He was really just this mid-range heel who was kind of over, and they kind of needed somebody. And Vince probably looked at him, saw this big, good-looking guy that can draw some money. Said, "Man, let's the guy he can wrestle pretty well. He can tell a good story. Let's do it. Let's put him up there." I think that lack of star power really hindered Austin's first title run, because you're right. It was Austin, and it was Undertaker, and it was Kane, but the main story was was Austin versus Vince. Vince was the top heel, but you can't book Austin versus Vince every month because nobody's going to care after a while.
Well, true, but Kane's my perfect example for this, because Kane was a star name manufactured. He had the it factor, he had the ability to be in the main event, and so you could say that, maybe Rock wasn't ready, but you can't say that Foley wasn't ready.
Absolutely not, he was.
And if Kane wasn't ready, well, they fooled you pretty good, because they put Kane in that main event really quickly and nobody questioned it.
Oh, no, I completely agree. I mean, you get to a point where, that character just debuts and is debuting against somebody so big that you need to keep that momentum going. Why wouldn't you try to give that guy,
So yeah, that's what I'm saying. So I don't think lack of star power or people not being ready is really a hindrance, because they had these five guys that I'm going to talk about. And furthermore, when he went to WCW, now the one thing I will really praise Russo on, because I really thought it was long overdue, was Booker T in the main event.
I completely agree.
Because I thought Booker T was like Scottie Pippen, like the most underrated guy on the roster over there, just the most misused. But unlike Scottie Pippen, there was no Michael Jordan at the time. I mean, right. I guess you could say Hogan. I don't know.
Sting, I guess, to a point.
Yeah, to a point. But I mean, this analogy, you get my point.
Right. I mean,
it's not the best analogy I've ever made.
Here's the thing. I think that what Russo had a problem with, in not just his WCW run, but also his TNA run. Russo had a big problem with the fact that he had all these over-the-hill guys that he's trying to book in the main event scene, that everybody is making so much money that I gotta book these guys in the main events. This is something that which is weird, that Heyman and Russo agreed on about the TNA roster.
Okay.
When Heyman wanted to take over booking for TNA. Heyman was going to wipe out half of the talent roster and bring up other guys. We were going to see guys from the independent scene, see guys from Ring of Honor come up, and see some of these other guys like AJ Styles who weren't really being pushed to a top main event spot, or they were just barely getting there, as being the focal point of the show. And that's what Russo and Heyman like to do. They like to take they wanted to get the older guys out. You saw the way Russo booked everything with Hogan, having him drop the title to Jarrett and having Jarrett lay down for him and firing him.
Yeah, but hold on, because Russo's story on what actually transpired there has changed very much.
And it's going to change no matter what, and nobody's going to ever know what the real thing is. But right. I mean, at that same point, yes, he favored some of his friends. The only reason Big Vito ever had a job in WCW is because he was friends with Vince Russo. The only reason Jarrett was ever a main event player was because him and Russo were tight.
And that's something, and that's exactly where I was going with this. Because my problem is, Jeff Jarrett, anybody can feel how they want about any wrestler. But when it comes to Jeff Jarrett, I am not a fan of Jeff Jarrett. I understand he has done good things for the industry, and I understand he's very passionate about the industry, and I understand that his mentality and his mind and passion for it is exactly what the industry needs at certain times. But in the main event scene, I'm sorry, he just does not belong there.
Russo really kind of fooled you a little bit in the beginning, because when Jarrett really first got his initial world title run, I was like, man, maybe he's not such an Intercontinental Championship contender guy. Maybe he actually could be a world champion. And then, flaws just started, all over the place.
I think that was just a pure lack of options at that point. When you
that
saw,
too.
When DDP was a guy who was hovering on the low end of the main event. Like, okay, if he's going to go against Goldberg at Halloween Havoc but doesn't win, that's fine. But
right.
But then eventually at that point, DDP was like the the upper crust of the main event, which is definitely not where DDP belongs. And DDP didn't even book himself that strong when he was booking.
No, and that's the problem with WCW is that they went from having an overindulgence of human beings that were main event characters to just everybody was just too old and just too slow, and they needed to push new guys into the main event, and they kind of just didn't have the right people. And you had to break up the Steiner brothers in order to get a main eventer out of Scott Steiner.
I don't think Scott Steiner's a main eventer.
I don't know.
And I like Scott Steiner.
Look, I don't think so either. But his character certainly made it so that he can make up with some of the flaws in the way he was created. They had to break up the Harlem Heat in order for Booker T to break out.
Well, that's fine.
They had and they had other guys who looked like they were going to really take over. I mean, at points, Wrath looked like he was going to be like a world title contender for a little while.
Yeah, which I'm not necessarily.
I'm not saying it's
Wrath wasn't good, but I wouldn't mind him in the main event because you buy it to a degree,
right? Because he's a big dude.
Yeah, and Stevie Ray. Look, I like Stevie Ray, and I love Harlem Heat as a tag team, but Booker definitely needed to break off and go solo.
I agree 100%.
But my thing is, because this is now twice that you're talking about the lack of star power or lack of options, but I don't necessarily see it that because. I'm going to throw out a name here, and in the Attitude Era, Ken Shamrock, okay, was he a main event? Yes. Did Russo want to be a main event? From what I've been told, yes, but Vince wouldn't allow it because, Ken Shamrock is a little sloppy, and so fine, I get that one.
Right.
But how about this name in the WCW? Buff Bagwell.
See, here's the thing. Buff was one of those guys where he looked the part.
Yeah, he was good on the mic.
He was pretty decent on the mic, and he wasn't
a
terrible wrestler, but man, if he did not become a main eventer in WCW and got fired immediately after his first match in WWE, that means that backstage, man, he must have just been the biggest douche on the planet.
Because that could be possible.
At that point, how Russo probably would have looked at him and said, I can make this guy a star. He's got money written all over him.
But that's exactly what I'm saying. So if he's favoring guys like Jeff Jarrett over guys like Buff Bagwell, and yeah, you're right. Neither one of us right now knows why Buff wasn't booked in the main event. But, that's just one name I'm going to throw out there. How come he was kind of absent from the main event? And furthermore, yeah, okay, fine. Sting's on the older side, but as we saw, Sting still had many years left in him. Sting didn't fare too well during the Russo era, and why is that?
I feel like that's one of those things that Russo doesn't like to come in and book a top guy as a top guy. I just feel like that's one of his, one of those things that he just does. I mean, he didn't fare well even when he was in TNA. Sting was just
that's my point. Like, his bias.
They try to turn him heel. And I mean, how do you turn Sting heel?
That's the second time he tried.
Exactly. And there are certain characters you can turn heel. When Hogan did it the first time, we believed it because he'd never been that way, and he was in such a good story that we wanted to see that happen.
And I'll talk. And and I know we both like comic books. I'm going to veer off our normal subject of wrestling, but I agree with you on that because if you notice, there are a lot of stories where Superman, there's an evil version of Superman out there. Where there's a lot of stories. Everyone loves the Venom symbiote story with Spider-Man, Spider-Man turning dark side. But there's not a lot of stories with Batman going bad. Why? Because Batman is so close to the edge, it doesn't really matter.
Exactly, and that was always the thing with Sting. Yeah. Yes. All right, you could have turned bleach blonde, surfer Sting heel, and people would have bought it.
Right.
But when you have a guy who's coming out, and he's a babyface, he's coming out wearing all white makeup with black highlights, wearing all black, and hitting people with baseball bats, dude, that guy's a heel.
Right.
Like, I don't care. He's a heel beating up heels.
Yeah, so flopping him, like, technically speaking, it doesn't really do anything for you.
It doesn't. And, the thing with the whole main event Mafia storyline they had going on in TNA, yeah, Kurt Angle is a heel. Yeah, of course you can book Booker T and Kevin Nash as heels and Scott Steiner. People are going to believe that. But when you introduce a guy like Sting who's been revered for such a long time and teeters on that edge so well that people don't want to boo the guy.
Right, and perhaps I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is just my, one of my fundamental ideas of when it comes to booking, and it's something that Russo doesn't seem to know. And once again, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they could try this, and it's been time tested and proven that what I'm saying is incorrect. But the way I look at it, from comic books that I mentioned and everything else, you seem to know that Sting really isn't going to be somebody to turn. But Russo seemed to have, this dead set goal that he wanted to do that, and it never once worked. And he never booked Sting correctly. He never really favored Sting all that well.
No, I agree.
But his personal biasness still dictated that he was going to give Jeff Jarrett a try. He was going to give his boys a try. And so it's not a knock on any of these people, although, yeah, I did say I'm not a Jeff Jarrett fan. I'm still not. But I'm just trying to point out that it really doesn't matter if you're good or bad. It doesn't matter if you deserve it or not. It doesn't matter if you can fill the role or not. You got to be in good with them. And that's biased booking, which that's one of my chief principles of why I'm not that big of a Vince Russo fan.
Well, by that same point, let's look at it from the other point of view.
Sure.
You can sit there and talk about Roman Reigns right now all you want about being a biased booking.
Yeah.
Vince looks at him, sees money, and he's going to put him in the main event no matter what. And now we know from a couple of weeks ago when I did the show with you,
Yeah,
I'm a
right.
Roman Reigns fan.
Right.
By that same point, you do know how he got there. And you do know how, a guy like Cena, where maybe a lot of people put that on his shoulders. Cena did start working indies before he started in WWE. Yes, was he mostly a manufactured WWE star? Absolutely. Yeah. By that same point, Cena busted his ass to get to where he belonged. And a lot of people don't feel that way about Reigns.
But, and that brings up a good point, because two points I have to that. One, when you look at the film Citizen Kane, for any of you who have seen it, the downfall of Citizen Kane was he believed that the people will think what he tells them to think.
Right.
Vince McMahon is in the same exact place where he thinks that we will just do whatever he says. And that's the wrong mentality, because once again, from our first episode together, I was saying that I believe that business is a matter of the customer is always right, and it's supply and demand. People want something, you give it to them, and that's how you make money. But then moving on to the other idea about personal biases and John Cena, in fact, Jim Cornette, big fan of John Cena.
Right.
And he booked him in the main event. And then furthermore, in terms of personal biases, why I'm a Jim Cornette guy as opposed to a Vince Russo guy. We know that Jim Cornette, or at least we think we know, that Jim Cornette really doesn't like Kevin Steen. And yet he booked him to win a world title in Ring of Honor. Because he can put his personal biases aside, because he understands that even though he may not get along with Kevin Steen, he knows that Kevin Steen belongs in that main event. So he will put all of his personal feelings aside and just do what's right by business. So that's why I'm a Jim Cornette guy, and I know you're not that much of a fan, but what's your response to that?
I mean, I get where you're coming from, but then, like at the same point, you look at, sometimes where he was booking for TNA, and you look at some of the indie guys who came in, and, Kevin Steen never got a shot in TNA. Okay. And he was over in Ring of Honor. There was no, I mean, I don't understand why they wouldn't have, Roderick Strong got a little bit of a shot in TNA for a little while. Austin Aries got a shot. I feel like that, Cornette can hold a grudge to a point where he won't bring guys in. Yeah. Steen was there. Yeah. Steen was a main eventer at the time. Maybe not a full blown, but he was on that crux of just being there. He was feuding with Generico. He had his, he was moving on up the card. I think that it was his only choice to do something like that. But by the same point, if you put the Young Bucks in Ring of Honor while Jim Cornette was booking them, these guys are going to be jobbers, and that's
I don't know about that.
I do. I mean, I believe it. I just feel that yes, to a point, you can see that he's done that, and I'm sure that Russo's put the belt on guys he didn't want to really put the belt on. I'm sure that there were guys in the Hogan being one of them.
Okay.
Some other guys. I'm sure that Russo's done business because business is needed to be done. By that same point, I don't know that Jim Cornette has. I think Jim Cornette is so biased towards the current crop of wrestlers that are coming out right now that I don't know if he would even know how to correctly even book some of these guys, because let's face it, two guys coming out and just super kicking the crap out of people, that for all intents and purposes, that is just like throwing dirt in the face of professional wrestling the old school way. But man, is it over.
Well, okay, a couple of things of that. Number one, I always entertain the thought that there's a possibility all this backstage stuff with Jim Cornette is a total work and he's just playing us.
I've always thought that it could possibly be the same thing too.
I can't escape that possibility. I really can't. So that's number one. But let's just say, for instance, let's say it is all legit. The number two thing is I want to clarify some statements. Yes, I'm not saying that Jim Cornette doesn't have biases, because of course he does. Everybody does. And I'm not also didn't want to make it sound like I think Vince Russo hates Sting or anything like that, because I don't think he does. I'm just saying,
I don't think so either.
I just think for you to be a Vince Russo kind of guy, you have to be on this like nth level of friendship. And while yes, occasionally he'll do business like in Hulk Hogan's case, but Hulk Hogan on the way out was completely embarrassed. He would never do that to Jeff Jarrett. You think in a million years Vince Russo would ever book Jeff Jarrett in that position? Never. No matter what the idea was, he would never humiliate Jarrett to that extent.
I agree. I just also, this is just one of those situations where I think Hogan was being a pain in the ass and didn't want to do business either.
But at the same hand, I can't argue with him, because why would he have dropped? If you're Hulk Hogan, why would you drop the belt to Jeff Jarrett? And plus, Hogan, look, yes, I'm a Hulkamaniac. I'm not going to deny that.
See, I'm not. And I know
you are.
And I know that's probably where our hang-up is.
Well, here's the thing. But I'll admit that Hogan, behind the scenes, he's another one who talks out of both sides of his mouth. He's another one that you can't really trust all that much. And, he has his own problems, and I'm not going to deny that. But when it comes to his creative control, let's say, he does have a long standing that a lot of people can't buy, is that who else knows what it's like to be the guy and go through iterations of attempted passing the torch and see it try, see it fail, and who else has that expertise? Nobody but Hogan.
No, I mean, you gotta admit, when you sit through
So
the
that's what I'm
guys,
saying.
you sit through the whole, the Ultimate Warriors of the world, where yeah, sure, Warrior was over, but man, he was no Hulk Hogan.
Right, and he knew that. Of course, maybe he's lying. Maybe he only is saying that now that he knows he can make the case. But I'm just saying Hulk Hogan definitely shows that he has a lot of things. And at the time, even now, I just don't see Jeff Jarrett in that main event scene. I don't think there's anything wrong with him being in the mid card. I don't think that there's anything he could even do to just crawl into the main event scene by now, because he's getting up in years, and it's nothing personal. I'm just saying that's just not where I see Jeff Jarrett. And if Hulk Hogan doesn't see that, well, that's the opinion of many that Jarrett just wasn't a main event dude.
No, I mean, I agree, and you know what? I think Hogan was probably pissed off at Russo because Russo's sitting there trying to book the guy against Billy Kidman. Now I understand. Vince Russo's looking at the future of the business, and he's trying to book these guys into against characters that are going to you're going to feud these guys with these guys to bring them up to another level. And maybe, hey, you know what? Maybe Billy Kidman might not have been the right choice at the time. But, man, was Kidman ever over in WCW?
But that's another thing. People want to complain about Hogan wanting to do business. He worked Billy Kidman. The Wall no-sold the leg drop. I mean, do you remember The Wall?
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong. At the time, I was quasi-fooled into thinking The Wall could have been somebody.
You know,
I'll admit it. I thought there was a shot.
And not for nothing, his later iteration when he was in TNA as Malice, he was actually a pretty good wrestler. I think that if he didn't have his personal demons, he could have been somebody.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. I'm just saying he definitely wasn't of the level to no sell the leg drop and just stand right up.
I agree. I agree. And that's the thing I hate that Russo does, is that sometimes he just does not protect people's finishes. And
yes.
Nothing makes me more mad to see a guy take a finish and stand up.
Yeah.
Nothing. And I don't care who it is. But when Savage comes off the top rope with an elbow drop and you got a guy like Warrior standing up right afterwards, no. Like, I'm okay with you kicking out at 2 3/4, but don't stand right up,
See, bringing that back, that's exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to hot-shotting. Sure, it's not exactly the same thing as, the big over-the-top, beer trucks or anything like that, but it's still the same thing. Because as this escalates, finishers are getting more and more dangerous. A DDT used to be a suitable finisher. A flying elbow drop used to be a finisher. Not anymore. We can't go to that world anymore. And thanks to certain people who hot-shotted, we're stuck in this area where things have to get more extreme before we can, and we can't go back. Things have to go to this nth level now, and
to a point,
there's no ceiling onto it.
But to a point, I think we're getting to a point where maybe we are seeing that it go back a little bit.
How so?
I think the WWE's written off the DDT, and it hasn't been. Let's face it, every match during the Attitude Era, somebody hit somebody with a DDT. Like, it was just like that move, like a change of direction move in the middle of it. A lot of people stopped using it, and now look at the revival.
True.
They use it. They use it like, I mean, they're throwing it like Jake the Snake, And I think that they're getting, if they're not beating people with it, which they have, they're getting through long 2 counts on it. I think we're starting to see the resurgence of some of these older finishes that maybe kind of got written off for a little bit, and people kind of stopped using to be finishers. Now, and I think that's what they need to do, is they need to realize that. It doesn't have to be, Aleister Black spinning around and kicking you in the mouth, or Dolph Ziggler winding up and kicking you in the mouth, or the Big Show punching you in the face. Yes, I get it. You want to bring a little realism to WWE, have some of those guys use those moves, it's fine. But man, you're right. It's just getting to a point where some of these finishers that I see, like especially in like New Japan and on the independent circuit, man, I wouldn't want to take that. That looks like it's gonna break my neck.
The Steenializer, I think, is one of the scariest moves I've ever seen, which I'm glad, that's one move that I'm glad WWE doesn't allow them to do, because that just, I cringe every time I see it.
I mean, the guy's going neck first into the middle turnbuckle. Like, I mean,
it's so not okay.
There's like no protection on that move.
No.
And and even still, like, I love Kenny Omega. I love his character, but man, that one-winged angel, man, that just looks like if he falls the wrong way, somebody's neck is gonna break.
Oh, I mean, like, I've seen the Styles Clash go the wrong way.
Yoshitatsu broke his neck on that.
Oh, it's not like it is. It's slow.
It is
so
hard to watch.
Yeah, it really is.
That's the reason why DDP, who used to use a move similar like that, stopped using that move, because it was dangerous.
Yeah, I forgot who it was. I think it was Dean Ambrose, but AJ had him up, and like Dean, I'm pretty sure it was Dean, was like screwing around, and like he didn't tilt his head back right away. Like, he'd let it dangle for a little bit, and like, he took the move fine, but because he didn't just, like, if I'm going to that move, I'm instantaneously,
my head is going.
Right.
You know what I mean?
All the way back instantaneously.
As far back as it goes, I ain't taking any risk.
Exactly. But Dean was like playing casual until like, for a little bit, and I got nervous just watching it.
It's scary, man. It really is, And those, a lot of these moves that, some of these guys are using, it's why the pile driver's injured so many people, and the WWE is just like, no, we're not going to use it anymore. And the vertebreaker looks like it's going to, if you take that move the wrong way, it's going to hurt you. Let's not do it.
At the same time, there are other companies that don't ban the moves, and their injury lists are not the same. So, I mean, I know we're veering off topic, but
it's a frenetic. That's the thing. I think for WWE, it's a frenetic pace.
I think it's a schedule. I think they're just overworked.
It is. It's just they're working at such a frenetic pace that after a while, their bodies are just going to start breaking down. I mean, kudos to a guy like The Miz who just does not get hurt.
Right.
And he works a safe style, and he's still entertaining, and he proves to everybody that I can go out there, and I can be entertaining, and I don't have to jump off the top rope every match, and I don't have to jump through the middle rope every match, but I can still tell a story.
I've done a video about that. I'm so over that. Like
that suicide dive needs to stop. Everybody does it. How many times do I need to see Seth Rollins do that? If you're you want to get the pop, jump over the top rope. If you want to and front flip over the top like you used to do, and do it once a month. Don't do it in every match.
Yeah, no, I could not agree more. And there's plenty, and believe me, there are plenty of moves that go on that list that aren't even necessarily as impressive. I'm just so tired of seeing the same things over and over again. But okay, so back on back on topic. So in terms of
I can
no, believe me. Well,
I can veer off on people overusing moves all day.
Well, we have plenty of other episodes of this show to go, so I think we'll be fine. So, so back onto the booking thing, and the idea of hot shotting and the idea of Cornette versus Russo, which is loosely what this has been going towards.
Yeah,
is I got to say that Jim Cornette, once again, and I'm not saying Jim Cornette is infallible, but he definitely knew how to protect finishers, protect
I agree.
Ideas like, oh, the guy goes to the hospital and all that stuff like that. Oh, whatever that happens, you knew it was serious. Or you knew the pile driver was a great way to write somebody off a TV or something like that.
Right.
Now, Russo is really good at setting out the skeletal outline, filling in the time slots, knowing what piece of the puzzle goes in where. But what that puzzle is, what that image is, that I think is Russo's biggest weakness because, once again, it doesn't have to be a concrete-filled limousine or Ferrari or Corvette or I don't know anything about cars, but whatever car that is.
It was a Corvette.
Corvette, there you go. Okay, so
I'm pretty sure it was.
Yeah, I don't even remember, but we don't need this all the time because once again, sooner or later, people are just going to get bored with it, and it's just going to become routine.
Right, and I agree. I mean, to a point, the WWE is trying to prove that now by doing some of these big hot-shotting angles with Strowman breaking the ring, throwing people off the stage into dumpsters. Yeah, you do that every once in a while. It looks impressive, and you're not going to overbook it. The thing is that the WWE needs to start doing some stuff to maybe garner interest back into the product, because I'm getting to a point now where if I don't watch Monday Night Raw, we're filming this on a Monday, if I don't go home and hit the DVR button and watch Raw, and I don't watch it for an entire week, man, what do I miss? I can go online and I can read about the show, and maybe what I miss is a really good 20-minute Seth Rollins versus Samoa Joe match, which gets interrupted in the middle of it because they want to save that match for the pay-per-view. But they didn't save the match for the pay-per-view because they went 20 minutes.
Right.
The WWE needs to, I like the brand split. I do. But the WWE needs to book their talent better so that we get these dream matches that may never happen again.
Oh, well, there's another episode we could definitely do because I'm opposed to the brand split. And I'm going to try to, I'm going to segue, I'm going to, we're running short on time, but I am going to save this with another Jim Cornetteism because the idea here, as he said, now there's plenty of problems I have with booking. Like, number one, I would love it if jobbers came back.
Yes.
Big thing for me. But Jim Cornette put it that a brand split is essentially unnecessary if you do one thing and you keep heels being heels and faces being faces and you don't really let them go back and forth too much and they don't face each other too much. Because if that's the case, you have a built-in brand split because the good guys will never face each other and the bad guys will never face each other.
And once one of those guys turns, now he's got an entire roster of guys to face.
Right, so that was why you had heels and faces. One of the many reasons you had heels and faces because it essentially was a built-in brand split that you don't have anymore. And all these principles that Cornette has talked about is the exact kind of things of why I back him up. And yeah, I know he can be biased, but once again, when it comes to things, the virtues that I'll give you, that I totally agree with you on Vince Russo, I look at it and I say, is there someone else who can do this? And I think the answer is yes, but when I look at a lot of the things that Vince Russo, that Jim Cornette has to bring to the party, I'm not sure anyone else can do that.
I will concede this. I think that Vince Russo can book a great show from start to finish, like you said, with the numbers hitting hitting everything. If they had a guy like Russo working in that capacity, but they had somebody else booking the actual show, we might start to get somewhere. Because I think what this boils down to is that I think we're driving at is the same thing.
Yeah.
If we had a combination of Vince Russo and Jim Cornette, we'd be in business.
And partnered up with Paul Heyman.
Well, that actually is just the guy. So let's just let Heyman run everything.
Yeah. And Ted Turner's bankroll.
Yeah. No. Of course. Of course.
Just everything.
Here, we're just going to give you all this money so you can do whatever you want with it.
Exactly. Okay. So as much as I would love to keep this going, we actually have to we have to wrap up. So. Everyone, the Slam Sessions with Albert Albanese, great podcast. Albert, tell everybody where they could find you and your other great podcasts as well.
You can find everything you need in two places. It's the Slam Sessions Podcast Network. It's facebook.com/the Slam Sessions Podcast Network. And Twitter, it's at the Slam Sessions. Go on there, take a look. And hopefully you'll find a whole bunch of crap that you like.
Okay, Albert, great guy, and he's definitely worth checking out. So if you like this show, definitely give him a check out. And thank you for checking out this show, Dave Knows Wrestling Podcast. And don't forget to give me a big thumbs up and to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already. So thank you very much. Thank you to Albert Albanese, and thank you to you for listening. And this has been Dave Knows.